Welcome everyone to this Capitol Hill briefing on the legal liabilities of the fossil fuel companies and their denial of science in the era of rapid climate change. My name is Mike Tidwell, Director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network and CCAN Action Fund. CCAN Action Fund is a host of today's briefing, along with our friends at the Center for Climate Integrity. Today, we're going to hear from municipalities who are suing fossil fuel companies for causing and denying climate change at the same time. And we're going to hear what Congress can do to stop these companies from gaining a liability waiver from these lawsuits. In the last couple of months, there has been new momentum of climate litigation against polluters. And as these cases mount, we'll continue to see industry attempt to evade justice. Congress obviously has a clear role in supporting and protecting these cases, and we'll hear more about that shortly. Meanwhile, lawsuits have been filed across the country by cities as small as Imperial Beach, California, and states as big as Minnesota. Some sue on the grounds of climate harm or nuisance. Others sue based on deception and fraud perpetrated against consumers by the fossil fuel companies. These cases seek justice for harmed citizens. But to be clear, if you're not speaking, if you don't mind muting, thank you. These cases seek justice for harmed citizens, but to be clear, these cases are not by themselves about stopping global warming. They are instead about surviving global warming, about forcing oil and other fossil fuel companies to compensate coastal cities for the cost of seawalls, for example, or providing resources that landlocked states need to deal with the health emergencies of heat waves and more. We know that only ambitious climate policy from Congress can ultimately solve the climate crisis, but in the meantime, cities are flooding, forests are burning, and farms are disappearing. And fossil fuel companies must pay for the damage, just like big tobacco is now paying for knowingly deceiving customers about the harms of cigarettes. As you're about to hear, justice in this context comes in many forms. On the panel today, you'll hear from Maryland U.S. Congressman Jamie Raskin, who's been leading the fight to hold polluters accountable in Congress. D.C. Attorney General Karl, Racine, and California Mayor Serge Dedina of Imperial Beach, California, have both brought cases against fossil fuel companies, and you're going to hear from them. And then finally, from Pamela Gilbert, an expert in protecting these states and cities to access to justice in terms of filing lawsuits and fighting back against the efforts of fossil fuel companies to evade liability. So our first speaker is Congressman Jamie Raskin on, Megan?
Yes.
He is, fantastic. So our first speaker is the indomitable Congressman Jamie Raskin, who represents Maryland's 8th District and has been one of the greatest champions for the issue of protecting liability in Congress. In May, Congressman Raskin authored a Dear Colleague letter urging leadership in Congress not to trade away fossil fuel liability, and he got 60 co-signers on that letter. He also hosted last October the very first congressional hearing on, or House hearing on Big Oil's history of climate denial. And as part of that hearing in October of 2019, Congresswoman AOC had a YouTube video that got millions of hits as she interrogated a former ExxonMobil scientist. So we're glad to be working with Congressman Raskin. Thank you for your leadership, Congressman, and take it away. Jamie, are you there? Maybe you're muted.
Can you guys hear me now?
Now
okay,
we can.
But I think I'm still having video problems. Can you see me or no?
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
good. Okay, great. Okay. It looked like it was still buffering. Hey, Mike, thank you for having me. Thanks to everybody out there who is fighting for the proper legal accountability for the massive damages wrought by big gas and oil and coal. we're not asking for anything more than the basic elements of due process. When there's an injury, there's a cause of action, and there's got to be satisfaction. Their rights don't mean anything if you can't vindicate those rights by suing for enforcement for injuries caused upon them. So I've been thrilled to work with everybody on this. And, when we wrote that letter back in May to blow the whistle on the carbon polluters trying to use the occasion of the COVID-19 crisis to insulate themselves against legal attack and against lawsuits for damages they've caused. I didn't think that many people were going to sign it. I was kind of amazed that we had such a huge response in the middle of the crisis, but it actually struck a chord with a lot of people, and a lot of my colleagues told me that they thought it was just essential and really important that we begin to raise this as a critical issue. As Mike says, we had a hearing, the first hearing in Congress on the question of the Carbon King's knowledge of the effects of the greenhouse gas emissions on the climate system. And this goes back many decades where they understood exactly what was happening. They were in the forefront of climate science research. They used it to inform their own industrial plans. They used it to inform their own allocation of risks and decisions about what businesses to engage in and what not. But they withheld it from the public. And so they basically deprived the public of the information that we needed to govern properly and to execute the best public policy on it. And the damages caused have been profound and in some sense incalculable, but that's the whole point of litigation, is to make incalculable damages calculable and to calculate them as best as possible. So I want to make sure that Congress is doing whatever we can to prevent efforts to interfere with lawsuits proceeding at the state level. And that, of course, is an essential aspect, not just of due process, but structurally of federalism, of making sure that people have the ability to vindicate tort claims at the state level against tortfeasors. And it's as simple as that. And it's not a question of, as the carbon industry would have it, of them being punished for something that benefited everybody. Well, if it benefited everybody, they certainly got their profits from it. The profits were privatized, and I suppose you could say everybody benefits from automobiles, or everybody benefits from asbestos, or everybody benefits from the commerce in tobacco. But that doesn't change the fact that all of those industries violated the rights of other people and caused the damages against specific citizens and specific communities and different kinds of victims. So the big gas and coal and oil, they got paid and have benefited and profited handsomely from their endeavors. But if they inflict torts against other people, they've got to pay for it. And they can't be private from the standpoint of profit, but somehow public utilities immune from lawsuit for the purposes of considering the damages that they inflict on other people. So anyway, these are tough times, obviously, with the court turning sharply to the right at every turn. And we have got to stand up real strong for the principle of tortfeasor accountability, even in massive industries, or especially in massive industries like what the Carbon Kings do. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to you, Mike, and I will stay for as long as I can.
Fantastic. Congressman Raskin, in case you have to slip away, just one question for you. Assuming there's a possible change in government in January and greater focus on climate change, I saw that an NPR poll earlier this week last week showed that climate change was the #1 issue on the minds of Democratic voters, ahead of healthcare and law and order or what have you. It's climate change. Now, do you anticipate, as there's a greater focus on climate legislation in Congress, that the oil companies are going to push even harder to get their immunity from this liability? And what do you expect the Congress to do?
Well, I mean, you guys are more expert on that than me. My sense is that they view litigation over their liability for the billions and billions of dollars of damages inflicted as their major problem going into the future. In other words, they've integrated climate change into their business model, and they're figuring out a way where they can profit from that. And now they're just worried about their liability exposure. So yes, I would expect that their pressure is going to be on to relieve them of their liability and accountability. So yeah, I think that's coming. I mean, the fact that everybody is so freaked out about the climate emergency demonstrates the fact that people have their eyes open about what's taking place with the hurricanes and the record fires and the record drought and the record flooding and the way we're being inundated by climate change. But it connects very much to the public health and the fact that we've seen in COVID-19 that the willful blindness of the Republican Party to invisible but serious threats is a massive danger to the health of our families, the health of our communities. And so COVID-19 is like a demonstration project of what it means to have scientific denialism there, and essentially an ideological approach to public health problems.
Great. Well, Congressman Jamie Raskin, thank you so much for joining us and for all your leadership on behalf of our state of Maryland. And we look forward to continuing to work with you. And I hope you can stick around as long as you can for any additional questions that might come from other panelists or participants. Our next speaker, I'm so pleased to introduce DC Attorney General Karl Racine. He has represented the District of Columbia in that capacity since 2015 and has spent his years in office defending those who need it the most. He has preserved affordable housing, he's cracked down on slumlords, he's prosecuted wage theft, and generally been a voice for the people. That's why it's no real surprise that he has now brought a case against the fossil fuel industry this past June. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Mr. Attorney General Racine. And Congressman Raskin, if you could mute yourself if you're not already muted.
Okay. Hey, thank you, Mike, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to all of you who have joined us for this important conversation today. Let me emphasize how much I appreciate the work of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network and the Center for Climate Integrity. And I certainly appreciate their hosting this event today. Also want to give a nod to the representative, Jamie Raskin, who has got to be the best lawyer on the Hill, an exceptional constitutional lawyer and professor for my money. I'm a big fan of his Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Project. And boy, do we need that more than ever these days. But thank you so much, Congressman Raskin, for your leadership on these issues. In your May 4, 2020 letter to Congress, in which you were able to garner all those signatures, you described the fossil fuel industry's conduct as being one of denial, deceit, and disinformation. And normally, when you have companies that sell goods or services, and they're wrapped around with denial, deceit, and disinformation, liability and exposure ensues. And that's what the District of Columbia has certainly decided in regards to bringing a suit. So back in June of this past year, DC filed a suit against 4 of the world's largest oil and gas companies, ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, and Shell, alleging that they knowingly concealed the role their products play in causing climate change. Importantly, we brought this suit under DC's Consumer Protection Procedures Act, which is a broad statute and has been interpreted as such by DC courts, and they prevent businesses, the statute does, from engaging in deceptive trade practices and misleading DC consumers. Our investigation revealed that for more than half a century, these 4 companies engaged in a complex multi-million-dollar public relations campaign to undermine the scientific research demonstrating that climate change is man-made. Drawing inspiration from big tobacco, the companies financed and employed industry associations and front groups to distort and conceal the dangers of their fossil fuel products. They hired a fake grassroots group previously used in the tobacco industry's disinformation campaign, that is the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition, don't judge a book by its cover, to manufacture public opposition to climate researchers and activists. And they hired some of the same scientists who falsely disputed the connection between tobacco use and cancer to do the same for the fossil fuels and climate change. As early as the 1950s, these 4 companies knew carbon emissions created by burning fossil fuels would one day pose an existential threat to humanity. The companies privately made investments to protect their own infrastructure from the effects of rising global temperatures. Publicly, however, they work systematically to generate doubt that climate change is man-made. They generated media coverage, hyping bogus research that disputed scientific consensus. They also published advertorials. They sort of envisioned the age of Trump with these advertorials, and these advertorials really masqueraded as editorials in major publications, including the Post, Washington Post, and the New York Times, falsely arguing that research did not prove that burning fossil fuels destabilized the planet's natural cycles. And when decades later, public awareness made the company's continued denial less effective, the companies pivoted to greenwashing. In advertisements and in newspapers, online and in the district's metro system, ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, Shell, and others all exaggerate their commitment to green, renewable energy sources. These ads obscure the fact that none of these companies invest more than 2.3% of capital expenditures in renewables. And now that they are all seeking to sell more natural gas, they market it as safe, clean, and emissions reducing. But all fossil fuel products create carbon emissions and all represent a threat to consumers. Today, importantly, scientists calculate that the world has less than a decade left to get carbon emissions under control or face catastrophic impacts. The District of Columbia, sitting between 2 rivers that are rising, is at particular risk. The tidal basin now floods around 30 times a year, a 5-fold increase from a few decades ago. And as our already hot and muggy summers grow more punishing, our residents, especially district seniors and other vulnerable residents, will be exposed to all manner of heat illnesses. These companies were not simply reckless in the pursuit of profits. Their deceptive advertisements and misleading claims violated the DC Consumer Protection Law. And that's why we brought our lawsuit, to end this disinformation and all the negative and lying campaigns, and to hold these companies accountable for harming district consumers. The fossil fuel industry should be held to the same standard as any other industry. And we're working hard to hold them accountable in the same way we would hold any other company accountable. Thank you. Look forward to any questions that I might receive.
Thank you so much, Attorney General for the District of Columbia, Karl Racine. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for representing, as you just laid out, the very vulnerable city and citizens of our nation's capital. And we look forward to following the progress of that case in the near future. Our next speaker is the mayor of Imperial Beach, California, the fantastic mayor, Serge Dedina. Mayor Dedina has won multiple environmental awards and helped found the organization called Wild Coast. The cost recovery case that he and his city have brought against the fossil fuel industry was one of the first in the entire country. These cases, of course, build on the history of deception within the fossil fuel industry, and the case for Imperial Beach also includes climate adaptation cost compensation. Mayor Dedina, it's a pleasure to have you join us from the West Coast. Take it away.
Well, good morning, buenos dias. Imperial Beach is an anomaly in Southern California. We're on the US-Mexico border. We're actually an anomaly because we're a small blue-collar beach town. I think the only one of the few ones left in Southern California, a majority minority community without a lot of money, unlike our multimillionaire neighbors to the north, surrounded by the US-Mexico border, but open water and a national wildlife refuge to our south, a national wildlife refuge to our north, and the beautiful Pacific Ocean and the California Marine Protected Area to our west. So when the tide gets high and the surf's big, and we've had these El Nino phenomena where we get the water temperatures are greater and you get thermal expansion, we've seen with just a little bit of surf, the worst coastal flooding that we've seen in our history. In fact, the kind where you wish there was a dike because the water just starts pouring into the street and into our estuary, sort of like cascading, right? And as a surfer, I have a photographic memory of pretty much every surf event in high tide for the last 45 years. So we had been seeing that and then did a study actually before this lawsuit in 2017, looking at the economic and biophysical impacts of sea level rise and coastal flooding on our city. And what we found was in our 4 square mile blue collar paradise, 30 to 40% of our roads and infrastructure would be underwater by 2100. That includes schools, our public works yard, 30% of our roads, actually about 30 to 40% of our residential areas. So, and you can imagine with a housing crisis in California where people can't afford to go anywhere else, that's bad news. We'd have to elevate our roads. Let's not worry about just the impact of people who live on the beach, but really just what it would take the city itself. And, as mayors, we're all obsessed with infrastructure, right? That's what we do. At least that's what we do on the ground here. That's what I'm obsessed with. And that came with a price tag. We actually had some economists go out and look at what that would cost. Just an initial foray on the ocean part of our city, $150 million. $150 million that we don't have as one of the lowest sales tax revenue cities in California. It sounds hard to believe, a city without a Parks and Rec department. A city where last year when we had coastal flooding and the federal government was closed, remember that? We actually had to clean up the flooding that happened on federal property and pay for it because they couldn't do it, they were shut down. So, and that was the money I would have spent on a Parks and Rec program that we could no longer pay for because we had to bail out the federal government. So we had the science, we had the forecast of what was to come. And so what we said was, well, obviously 36 of the world's largest fossil fuel companies, they're the ones to blame. They caused the warming. They lied about the science. They carried out this campaign of deception. And more importantly, my residents have to pay. Our seniors won't have a new senior center. My kids won't have a Parks and Rec department. We can barely afford to pay for our sheriffs and firefighters and lifeguards, and so we're gonna have to be taking money away from the programs that we need to serve the people who 30% of our kids live in poverty, to pay the cost of these fossil fuel companies, as Representative Raskin said, privatized, right? And so that's really where this lawsuit came out. And, you know, our lawsuit, whether or not Congress does something to protect us, and I sure hope they do, I just want to make this clear. It has nothing to do, that will have nothing to do whether or not, or a bearing on whether or not we did or will do our lawsuit. You know, our lawsuit is only about the harm that Imperial Beach, our 28,000 residents in our city, are suffering, and more importantly, the costs that we're bearing right now and will have to bear in the future. What our residents, workers, and employees will have to pay. So it's Congress's job to solve climate change. It's my job to make sure, and I think AG Racine, you said this, that we can survive it, right? Like, you know, that's the same thing from DC. And all my other colleagues in California that have filed these suits. You know, and the lawsuit's about making sure that happen, and making sure that these fossil fuel companies who knowingly cause climate change, and you know, we've seen the science, we know what's happened really since the mid 80s and 90s, right, when emissions have dramatically spiked. Now we have the data on the campaign of deception, and I can't wait to see you in court, Attorney General Racine. Amazing job of delivering the summation of why we're all here, right? And then, and really are charging my residents for the cost. So great to be here. Thank you, Congressman Raskin. Thank you, Attorney General Racine. I've actually talked climate with your wonderful Mayor Bowser at a climate conference in Chicago. So, and thank you, Mike, for all the work that you guys are doing as well.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mayor Dedina. And if you're just joining us and you came in a little bit late, my name is Mike Tidwell, Executive Director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network and CCAN Action Fund. This is a briefing for Capitol Hill staff and others on the liability that major fossil fuel companies have for the climate denial history that they've engaged in and the climate impact that we're seeing across our country, and the lawsuits that are increasingly being filed by cities as small as Imperial Beach, California, and states as large as Minnesota and others. Our speakers so far have been Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland. We heard earlier from Attorney General Karl Racine of the District of Columbia. Of course, just now, Mayor Dedina of Imperial Beach. And now we're going to turn to Pam Gilbert. She is our next speaker. She has served over 35 years in the consumer advocacy realm in Washington, D.C. She has testified over 50 times and has made dozens of appearances in the national print and electronic media. She has served as executive director of the Consumer Product Safety Commission and is currently a partner with the law firm Cuneo, Gilbert, and LaDuca. I am going to turn it over to Pam, who's going to talk about what the fossil fuel industry has been doing in response to these lawsuits and why Congress must help protect these cases. Pam?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. And before I begin, I just want to say that this has been so inspiring for me. This was a tough weekend for many of us after the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and to be on a panel with 3 elected officials, 3 public servants who get up every day, and you can tell, working so hard to make this world a better place and make their constituents' lives a better place, really gives me hope. So this was certainly needed for me today. So I'm so happy to be here. So I'm going to sort of go back to where Congressman Raskin left off to talk about the role of Congress in the efforts to hold polluters accountable. And that role really is twofold. One is to continue investigating the industry misconduct that our speakers have talked about, and then also to proactively protect access to the courts. Congress has a rich history of investigating corporate abuses that have led to groundbreaking revelations and reform. Probably the most famous and most recent in our minds is the example of the tobacco hearings, where the 7 CEOs from Big Tobacco came to Congress, stood up, and swore under oath that nicotine is not addictive, despite the internal industry documents that proved that they knew that, in fact, it was. The deception that was uncovered by those investigative hearings facilitated the industry's landmark tobacco settlement with state attorneys general, and also helped lead to FDA regulation of cigarettes. And the fossil fuel industry's campaign of deception is strikingly similar to what we saw with the tobacco industry, and it calls for a similar and strong response from Congress. Congress should use its full powers of oversight and investigation to uncover the complete scope of the fossil fuel industry's lies and misconduct. The hearing that Congressman Raskin held last October was really fabulous, and it brought forth powerful firsthand testimony regarding the industry's early understanding of climate change. But there really is much more that can and should be done by Congress to investigate how this industry manipulated the public and policymakers to preserve their profits at the expense of the planet. But in addition to Congress's investigatory role, a second but equally really crucial role that Congress needs to play in this fight is to protect access to the courts for the lawsuits that you've just heard about. And now, historically, we have seen major industries have come to Congress and asked for immunity from litigation when they have faced this litigation over harms caused by their products and their conduct. And interestingly, but maybe not surprisingly, the more dangerous the harm, the more serious their campaign for immunity is. And so the tobacco industry came to Congress and asked for liability waiver in return for regulation, but they didn't get it. The asbestos industry has been asking for decades for immunity. Luckily, they have not received it. But unfortunately, Congress did in 2005 pass legislation to shield the gun industry from lawsuits due to gun violence. And that legislation continues to block families from holding that industry to account. So given this history, we know there's no doubt the oil and gas companies and their trade associations are going to lobby for a liability waiver when climate legislation becomes a realistic possibility in Congress, which we hope will be in the next Congress. This is the playbook, and actually we've already seen the fossil fuel industry go at it. So in 2017, the Climate Leadership Council, which is a group that's backed by the fossil fuel industry, when they first debuted their carbon pricing proposal, it included immunity from climate change lawsuits. Now, about 2 years later, CLC quietly dropped that immunity provision from their platform because there was such a backlash from the environmental community. But the cat was really out of the bag about what they want. And then again, in this past March, when Congress was looking at the early stages of COVID relief legislation, a proposal was floated in the Senate that would provide the entire energy sector with complete immunity for any action they took in response to COVID-19, unless you could prove that the company intended to inflict harm, which you can never prove. So for all intents and purposes, that would have been complete immunity. And that's when Congressman Raskin stepped in and he drafted a letter, and 59 other members of Congress signed it, opposing any kind of liability shield for the fossil fuel industry. And this proposal fortunately died, although the broader push for immunity in COVID legislation continues. But we know the oil and gas industry is going to look for this kind of liability waiver, and Congress should not provide it. Congress should really never provide legal immunity to an entire industry, but providing a liability shield for polluters in climate change legislation is a particularly terrible idea. Legislation to address climate change going forward is completely unrelated to lawsuits that are seeking to address harm that has already been done. The first is what Congress and legislative bodies do all the time. They establish public policy for the future. Lawsuits seeking compensation for past injuries is what the courts do. It's completely apples and oranges. And courts are uniquely suited for the task. Litigation with discovery, the adversarial process, and expert testimony is really the ideal system for ferreting out the facts, applying the law, and then deciding damages. This has been the role of the civil court system for centuries, as Congressman Raskin talked about, to determine fair compensation for wrongdoers, to pay for harms that they've caused. Climate change lawsuits are no different. The damages might be larger, but the principles are the same. And furthermore, as you've heard from the Attorney General and the Mayor, Allowing fossil fuel companies to escape accountability for their decades of deception will set a terrible precedent. Think about it. If powerful industries know they can use their political muscle in Congress to escape responsibility for wrongdoing, what will it lead to? More wrongdoing, more harm, and millions left without recourse. And if the companies responsible for climate change aren't held accountable to pay for the damage, it's not like the damages go away. The people of Imperial Beach, of Washington, D.C., and of all the other states and communities across the country that are suing, they're going to be on the hook for the billions of dollars in adaptation and recovery costs. Or, if, as is likely, if they can't afford it, they'll simply suffer the damages and the flooding and the devastation without the resources to address the damage. And in fact, we could lose entire communities. And the responsible parties, the fossil fuel industry, will have gotten away with it with no accountability. It's just the worst idea ever. But unfortunately, for those of you who are listening who have a role in Congress to play, simply not putting a liability shield in legislation is not quite enough. Congress actually has to proactively protect the cases by doing something called including a savings clause in any climate legislation. And this is because in recent years, the Supreme Court opinions have increasingly interpreted federal statutes and regulations as preempting the kind of damages lawsuits we are talking about, even where it was not Congress's intent to preempt those cases. So to ensure that climate legislation does not inadvertently or advertently preempt these damages lawsuits, the legislation has to include a savings clause, which is a provision that would explicitly state that nothing in the bill is designed to preempt or displace lawsuits that are brought for damages. And this kind of provision is necessary whether the legislation itself explicitly or implicitly says anything about litigation. So Congress has a very important role to play here, both in investigation and in proactively protecting access to the courts. We're going to have our work cut out for us, but I'm confident we can prevail if we all work together. And I'm going to end there. Turn it back to Mike.
Thank you so much. That was Pam Gilbert, who's really been leading the charge on Capitol Hill to help Congress interpret the incredible wave of lawsuits that are happening across the country and to preserve the right of attorneys general like Karl, Racine, mayors like Serge, Dedina, to file suit and to maintain those suits moving forward. We're getting a number of questions, and I wanted to come back to you, Attorney General Racine of the District of Columbia. We now see at least 4 or 5 attorneys general representing states who are now filing lawsuits against the fossil fuel majors. Do you see this reaching a kind of tipping point? You know, 2 years ago, it was just a couple, now we're up to 4 or 5. Do you see this heading the direction of tobacco, where virtually every attorney general in the country wound up filing suit? Are we reaching a tipping point here?
That's an interesting question. You point out correctly that a couple years back, it was really New York State and Massachusetts who were leading the way. And you might remember that those 2 states, what they did was they sought documents from the fossil fuel industry, and they were met with a fierce resistance by the fossil fuel industry, questioned their bona fides, their ability to even request documents, brought suit against those 2 state AGs in Texas, home court, to try to get those 2 AGs investigations to be shut down. And I give those 2 AGs a lot of credit, for surviving. And since that time, there are about 6 actions pending. I do believe that you'll see more states complete their investigations and file suit. I don't think you're going to get to the level of a bipartisan number of, say, 38 or even 45 or 50. And the reason goes back to something that was talked about earlier, and Ms. Gilbert touched on this, and that is that the fossil fuel industry has been preparing for this for a long time. and they have invested their monies in politicians. As of 2016, the fossil fuel industry gave over $37 million to elected Republicans, about $3 million to elected Democrats. I think the action is going to be interesting in states like Louisiana, where clearly the climate change situation is going to have extraordinarily devastating impact. But Louisiana is one of those states that has been receiving a lot of money from the fossil fuel industry in the name of their elected officials. And it'll be interesting to see whether states like that go ahead and bring suit or continue to follow the lead of their sponsors, if you will. So no, I don't think we're looking at a 45 state action. I think we're looking at more like 20 or so, and it may in fact divide on partisan lines.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. And Mayor Dedina, I wanted to ask you, you paint a tragic picture of your small community, a community that mathematically cannot be a big contributor to climate change. You're just a small community. The climate change is coming from much larger forces of pollution globally, but the impacts are being experienced by citizens in your community. I'm wondering what emotions you experienced even after you filed your lawsuit, as you see fossil fuel companies continue to deceive the public if you watch television, you would think all these major companies, Chevron and others, are all about algae and they're green companies. How do you feel? What kind of emotions do you and your fellow citizens experience as you see these record tides?
Yeah, so, just remember, and all of you have seen the news, and, California is experiencing, and the West Coast, Oregon, and up to Washington, a climate, apocalypse, right? And, the apocalyptic images of smoke, the suffering, the deaths of firefighters. One who was from San Diego, we're in San Diego County recently. Those fires are still going on. So obviously, I think the emotions are, I think there's a lot of fear right now, anger, obviously concern, but I think a lot of it has to do with anger. And I think the comparison to the public health issue, where all of a sudden we're manipulating public health information to not be about science. The science is very clear. We know what's happening. And just to call out to my colleagues in California, Imperial Beach was along with San Mateo and Marin counties, then Bold, Santa Cruz and Richmond in the Bay Area also filed lawsuits. And Santa Cruz lawsuit was the first one that was really about not just sea level rise, which we did, but it was also about climate change that would happen to the east of them, where all the forests were burning. And a good colleague of mine lost his house in those blazes just a little bit north of Santa Cruz. So serious stuff we're experiencing in California, not unlike what's happened in Australia. And we have mudslide season to come, right? So yeah, obviously anger. And one thing though I think is really important is, and I just wanted to make sure I mention this, is alliance with science. So we're lucky to have the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, obviously one of the world's great oceanographic and marine science educational research institutions. Literally, they've adopted our city and are developing technology and tools to help us forecast flooding. So they have that there. We hope that'll be deployed all over the world, as well as actually doing the groundbreaking research. Our kids can be in the field with some of the world's great coastal geomorphologists. And my son actually studied with one at UCLA, who are looking at modeling this stuff. So I think that science alliance with cities is critical. And I think that role of having science and give us feedback and advice on where we go and how we work with this is absolutely critical. So I got to translate that anger into action and really smart, strategic, legal action in this case. And again, it's a pleasure to be with all these growing states and cities that are working on this.
Thank you, Mayor. And Pam, here's a very interesting question from one of our viewers named Elliot, and I'll just read the question. A number of companies being sued are also in favor of a carbon tax and are conducting research and development programs on biofuels and renewables. Even if they were violators of the public trust in the past, do you have any reason to believe that these companies have changed their tune and might actually contribute to climate legislation moving forward, or are these companies so far irredeemable?
So one hopes that they will contribute to climate legislation moving forward, and they'll put their wrong-headed ways behind them and want to work together with Congress and with states and try to address climate change going forward, because we can't continue to do what we're doing, right? We have to address this problem or we're not going to survive. And so let's hope. But and this is what I tried to get across before. We talk about two different things when we talk about the policy going forward that we absolutely is an emergency we need to work on, and these lawsuits that have been brought by Imperial Beach and Washington D.C. and so many others that are addressed, that are focused on past damages and the past conduct of the industry, what they did, how they lied about it, and the damage that was caused, that needs now to be paid for. The paying for, there's no question that needs to happen, and the question is who's going to be held accountable to pay. And what we do in the United States of America through our court system is we hold wrongdoers accountable to pay. So as far as the lawsuits are concerned, what the industry does going forward vis-a-vis public policy is not relevant. What's relevant is what they did, what they knew, the damage that was caused, and if it can be proven in court, then they are obliged to pay for it no matter what they do going forward.
Thank you, Pam Gilbert. Attorney General Karl Racine of the District of Columbia, a couple of questions. Number one, we know that, take tobacco, for example, the public became keenly aware of the impact of tobacco smoking. Cancer deaths and other medical complications became known to virtually every family in the country. And then the story of deception that arose and finally was translated into legal action, especially in the 1990s. So the public understood and supported these actions. I think the same can now be said of opioid abuse. Are you seeing that connection being made with climate change in your own city? And two, how much money do you think would be needed to protect your great city from those two tidal rivers and the other impacts of climate change?
Really huge questions there, Mike. Let me first talk about my sense of what the public understands and what it may not understand. And let me associate myself with comments that were earlier made by the mayor, Ms. Gilbert, and Congressman Raskin, who all talked about the public sense that there is something really wrong going on with the climate, and that as far as a cause goes, most logical and science-based rationale really leads to us as human beings and the fossil fuel industry. I think if you look at surveys and information from the public, it's clear that at first, the complexity around science was a point at which people could be confused. And that's why the fossil fuel industry spent so much money over such a long period of time to try to be confusing to the public. Now, there's a powerful sentiment, certainly amongst younger people, as defined by under 50, that, you know what, the fossil fuel industry, we should take a hard look at them. And perhaps they are, in fact, accountable. I think that now we're also, as lawyers and scientists, better able to tell the story of the actual deception. And when you have evidence of the companies themselves readying themselves because of what they see coming, and then acting as if and telling people it's not coming, you've got your classic, kind of hypocrisy at play. So I'm confident in our ability to tell the story, and I'm confident in the growing number of people who already accept it. As far as damages go, in terms of what it would take to protect the District of Columbia from those two rivers, coming down on the city, I can't give you with precision what the costs and expenses would be. That's something that we would certainly develop in trial. So maybe later on, as we get closer to a trial in that case, I can spout out the damage theory to you.
Thank you, Attorney General. Very interesting question for you, Mayor. We have someone who has written in, and their question is this: I live in an area that has experienced record numbers of floods over the past several years, including Tropical Storm Beta, which is flooding out parts of my city right now. How do you hold companies accountable for the damage that has already been done and the homes that are still in disrepair from storms like Hurricane Harvey that ravaged the Gulf Coast in 2017? And I guess to you, Mayor, are there impacts that have already been experienced or you anticipate are going to be experienced before your lawsuit hopefully comes to fruition? How do you manage not only for adapting to a changing sea level and perhaps dikes and levees, but also the damage that's already been done in the past?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. First, my heartfelt prayers and support to all our friends in the Gulf Coast and really on the East Coast that are really way ahead of the curve in suffering coastal flooding, a lot more pervasive, this nuisance flooding, and obviously with tropical storms and hurricanes that's gone on the Gulf Coast and East Coast rather than on the West Coast, but our time's coming. So we haven't experienced the type of coastal flooding you've seen with hurricane-related damages on the Gulf Coast and East Coast, even the nuisance flooding. We have seen it increasing, and it's cost us money. So our lawsuit's about what we're experiencing now, what we have experienced in the last few years, but really what's coming in the future and what it's going to cost us to adapt. But I think that really brings in the whole environmental justice, social justice element of these issues, and that who can afford to pay, right? And who can afford to move, and who can afford to recover. And I think those are really some of the issues that are coming out. So my city in Malibu, communities can form geologic hazard districts and spend $30 million to put sand on their beach. Well, that's more than our entire city budget, right? Our residents, actually, we have a high poverty rate near the beach, which is interesting for our city, not something I'm proud of, but so our residents can't afford to do that, nor do I think that you should be raising money to put sand on the beach to pay for what oil companies cost, because I'd rather raise money and invest back in the senior center, parks and rec department. So that's really who are the winners and losers in climate change. Well, wealthy cities and wealthy communities can adapt and recover. They can pay for that. They may have to do some movement around that, but low income cities and underserved areas are at risk, and their residents are going to disproportionately suffer from this. And I think that equitable investment back into helping people adapt and recover, right, is critical. And I think that's what's really coming out when you see the fires and who's still in the trailer park, or as a result of these hurricanes, or folks can't get back in a house. I mean, that's the climate crisis, and those are our own climate refugees as well.
Thank you so much, Mayor. You really are on the front lines. This entire field of policy concern under the heading of environmental justice, your citizens certainly are living that day to day. Pam Gilbert, I'm going to give you the last word here. What do you see coming in the next few months on Capitol Hill, with or without a change of government, in terms of Congress's role in dealing with climate change, and for those who say that the best way to deal with these issues of climate impact is in Congress, not in the courts? What are your closing thoughts on that broad question?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks again to my fellow panelists who have just been remarkable. So thanks, Mike, and I'm sounding like a broken record, but there is such an important role for Congress to play here in addressing climate change so we can get a handle on what is going on in Imperial Beach and in Washington, D.C. and in all of these communities across the country, and it's just going to get worse for them. And we need a national policy that's going to take money and cooperation and the business community working with individual citizens, states, cities. We have an emergency. It's a climate emergency, and it needs to be addressed as a matter of public policy. But we have to look at the lawsuits and the damages that have already been done by the really despicable conduct of this industry. And that's a separate question. And I'm so pleased to see that these lawsuits are being filed. And I'm so pleased to see that this looks like a trend that is going on across the country, because these communities, except for maybe small exceptions of the very, very most wealthy, they can't afford to do what needs to be done for the adaptation and the recovery due to the damage that has already been done. And so someone is going to pay. These are not damages that we're making up out of the whole cloth. Somebody has to pay, and it's either going to be the citizens, the individuals, the communities, the communities that can least afford it, or we are going to ask the industry that knowingly caused the damage to kick in and pay for the adaptation and the recovery. And it's a critical piece of what needs to get done to protect the country and to protect our citizens, along with climate change legislation that we sorely need going for the future.
Great, thank you so much. Pam Gilbert, former Executive Director of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and now an attorney with the law firm Cuneo, Gilbert, and LaDuca. Thank you also, Mayor Serge Dedina from Imperial Beach, California. Thank you so much for making time for us fairly early in the morning for you. We really, really appreciate it. And Karl Racine, Attorney General of the great city of the District of Columbia, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for paving the way for what will inevitably be other attorneys general in states like DC, and DC is a state and hopefully will be officially a state in the near future. Also, thank you to my member of Congress, Jamie Raskin of Maryland, who was not able to stay throughout the program. A big thanks to Jamie and his entire staff for all the work that they do on this and many other progressive issues. So with that, I want to thank CCAN Action Fund and the Center for Climate Integrity for hosting this briefing, and thank all of you for joining across the country. Have a great day.